For almost all of human history, as long as we've had personal property, we've been wagering things with other people. It's among humanity's oldest pastimes, and as such there are so many different methods of gambling, from using dice to cards to sports betting, lotteries and all sorts of other things. We don't have time to discuss every single type of gambling in history in a video like this. But what we can do is discuss the broad strokes, and specifically how gambling and its efficacy may be affected by a world that is filled with magic, mind reading, illusions, and future sight. Many of our most classic of games would just fail to work in a world where these are legitimate options for people to use. So in today's video, we're going to explore what gambling looks like when it is actively trying to circumvent some of fantasy's more potent magical innovations that might help in cheating in our regular games in this world. Because I'm tired of our ragtag groups of fantasy heroes having an unrealistically easy time swindling and cheating their way through a gambling hall, using just the most basic of magics. So what do I mean? How can fantasy fraudsters cheat in gambling? A few big ways. Firstly, precognition and remote viewing allow individuals to cheat in two very different kinds of games. No lottery can exist in a world where people can legitimately predict the future. And many games of skill that involve asymmetric information, such as poker, fall apart pretty quickly if you can see the other people's cards. Illusion magic, especially combined with sleight of hand, would make it very easy to switch outcomes on the fly of random elements in games like dice or cards. Enchantment magic allows for the manipulation of other players, arbiters, participants in the game or race, animals, all sorts of things, and manipulating individuals is a surefire way to manipulate the circumstances, especially if those individuals' actions determine who wins. Telekinesis may make it very easy to perform sleight of hand tricks with cards, or manipulate the roll of a dice, or a roulette wheel, for example. And even legitimate contests of pure skill can be influenced by magic, using haste, magical accuracy boosting, slowing down your opponents in a race, for example. Curses and blesses, all of these can change contests of skill into anything but. But why does any of this matter? People have been cheating at gambling since there has been gambling to cheat at. And yet, even in the modern day, we still have dice and card games, lotteries, slot machines, and even sports betting. Well, although cheating exists within our world, it is limited by the scope of practicality and human ingenuity. Because all of us humans start our games and our lives with similar basic resources available to all, cheats need to generally bring external resources into the game, such as a group of accomplices, an electronic device, or some sort of trained skill, either in sleight of hand, which is spottable, or something like counting cards, which is counteractable if the rules are modified enough. And these methods of training yourself to circumvent the rules of a game are limited in their scope and in which games they can be used in. In essence, most modern cheating happens with co-conspirators and some form of external advantage, be that a device that remotely views and analyses the game's situation, be that false dice, or some form of trick or tactic that enables you to do better than the odds. All of these things create evidence, which in theory can be spotted and acted on, at least in public perception. This is the important point, because when humans gamble, we want to be assured that the rules are going to be followed, and if the rules aren't followed, they will be effectively and properly enforced. If this isn't the case, then a gambler is far less likely to wager their money or their resources on a game. And magic in a fantasy world is a way to circumvent the rules of a game that may well be undetectable and therefore potentially unenforceable. So today I'm going to try and propose a game which negates as many magical cheating possibilities as possible, to allow our fantasy gamblers to have that reassurance that allows them to bet it all on a good old-fashioned wager. To begin this quest, I want to take a page from our video's partner, The Wandering Tavern by Homie and the Dude. A Studio Ghibli-inspired TTRPG setting with plot hooks, layers and characters galore. The 200-plus page book filled with everything you need to run this setting is available right now in the link below. And if you were to use the code GRUNGEONMASTER, all caps, that you'll also find in the description, you'll get 10% off. And as an added bonus, you'll help out the channel as well. Because as well as being multiple airships, a tavern, a setting, and filled with mysteries galore, The Wandering Tavern also contains a gaming hall. And this gives us our first hint of how to enforce fair-feeling wagers in a world filled with magic. The gambling house of The Wandering Tavern is run by this delightfully shady-looking fellow, Cogswell, an automaton with multiple copies of himself roaming the gaming floor. First, using an automaton is really smart because it implies in the minds of the gamer an unbiased, impartial arbiter, especially because most enchantment spells only work on humanoid targets. As a construct, Cogswell is also immune to sleep of all kinds, and also has an ability that makes him unalterable in his form by magic. With a group of unenchantable enforcers roaming around the gaming hall, your casino, your gaming house, makes an excellent start in making patrons feel like their concerns are being felt and their games are going to be fairly adjudicated. In a lower tech setting, you could also achieve a similar effect with Nistel's magic aura to change the creature type of your pit bosses and your dealers into something far less targetable by most enchantment spells. It is all well and good having unsleeping enchantment-proof enforcers, but if your games are unfair or cheatable in other ways, well, that doesn't help you that much. In terms of illusions, enchantments, boosting, cursing magic, and even using invisible observers, including like other invisible people or clairvoyant sensors, a rudimentary magic detection network may be all you need to observe and potentially single out all of these effects. It highlights the ability to see most people using magic in this area and allows you to see what type of cheating they are doing. In D&D specifically, there are a few ways that you can bypass magic detection. One of those being using psionics instead of magic. Such things as the telekinetic feat, allowing you to move dice as they roll. That is also psionic power, not a use of the spell Mage Hand. And future predictions may well not be caught by this either. They've happened before you even enter the casino, with augury or contact other plane, for example. I don't think, therefore, that for the majority of a fantasy world, a lottery or any lottery would be an effective method of gambling or fundraising. For these exact reasons. It's just too hard to filter out those who have precognitively got the answer in some way. In a lottery, too much relies on the fact that no one can predict the outcome of random number generation, which is not necessarily true in a fantasy world. But other than this caveat, it seems that our fantasy gambling houses are pretty well set, using specifically wagers and games of chance that are supervised by individuals who can detect magic in the area and who are constantly vigilant, would essentially recreate the conditions of a modern casino, only with more ways that you can be kicked out for cheating or being perceived to cheat. This assumes that you can have some sort of magic detection ability, which does not come cheap if you're having to use the spell, and therefore may relegate these sorts of gambling houses that have this much security to very, very high-end, very high stakes, and very quick games. where fortunes can be won or lost in a matter of minutes, making gambling kind of inaccessible and only for the wealthiest of wealthy people. Of course, you would also need to come up with some countermeasures for future sight, which is a really impressive skill, specifically when it comes to random number generation. Adding a layer of abstraction to the regular random number generation may be a very effective tool here. For example, if you have a hand that is certain to win, and this is the hand that you have seen with your future sight, well, what if every few rounds at a separate random interval, the value of the specific hands in the game changes? Then the person predicting the future needs to know at what stage in the game they will get this hand and how useful that is going to be in context of the constantly shifting rules. Ways of doing this could be that on the roll of a dice every few rounds, low cards beat high cards, or a game which modifies the value of your hand by the hidden values of other players' hands, for instance. So if you share any numbers with them, those are cancelled out, making your hand either worth more or less as other people cancel each other out. Increasing the complexity and the random variables makes it far more difficult to use precognition to win. You would need to know the contents of all players' hidden hands, and even if you saw yourself pulling the greatest hand in the game, you would need to know the contextual facts of everyone else's hand, and the state of the ever-switching rules of the game, which is genuinely tough. However, certain games rely less on individual skill to outplay your opponents. Games of pure chance may well be scuppered in terms of future sight, to be honest. Things like craps and roulette. But this all assumes a fairly well-regulated body that governs the playing of these particular games in a way that is motivated to remove any potential for fraud or cheating. These settings aren't where most gambling occurs. Oftentimes, gaming houses use illegal or scummy methods to try and get as much money out of their clients as possible. But I'm not even necessarily talking about that, which is a reality of gambling and one of the reasons why it is not the wisest of ways to spend your time. Historically, and even into the modern day, most wagers do not happen in well-regulated environments. They happen socially, as part of interpersonal communication. This may be becoming less true, especially in the last 15 years, with the absolute explosion of highly exploitative, highly addicting, solo gambling in the palm of people's hands. But this claim is still indeed broadly true. As much as our phones and casinos are designed in the modern day around dark patterns and isolation, the fact remains that gaming, gambling, and wagering are all some of the most social of situations. I bet I can hit that tree with this rock is a wager that has been levied countless times in our history. Far more than there have been hands of cards played. But if you can't trust that stranger in the tavern not to swindle you with magic that you cannot possibly detect, after all you've got no experience, or you can't trust that John down the road, who often turns up for games in the tavern, who may or may not, nobody's quite sure, have had a small stint at a magic academy in his youth, if you can't prove that neither of them are actually cheating, and they can't prove that they're not cheating, and they start winning suspiciously, well then the whole fabric of the game starts to fall apart. There needs to be an expectation of fairness and enforceability of rules, even when cheating does occur. What game can the regular folk possibly play which requires not too many specialist resources, and that is also equitable for all peoples? Let's try and make one. First, I think we need to be using dice. There are many other ways of generating random results, but dice have a few clear advantages. They are relatively easy to make from most materials like wood, clay, or bone. And unlike, for example, cards, dice often have tactile elements like the pits on most of our classic D6 designs. This allows for illusion magic to be seen through, essentially, with an extra sense of touch. And that suspicious gamers can check a non-visual clue to ensure that their eyes have not been deceived. Like with our proposed gaming hall, we need some more extra layers of obfuscation of randomness to ensure that people who have some sort of limited future sight can't just run away with any game we're playing. This can be done using a separate dice to control the values of things. For example, with an even number, the game plays as normal. With an odd number, 6 is actually the lowest and everything's reversed. It's the simplest version of this. Or you can rely on game rules to modify the randomness with additional factors of human behaviour, such as if you roll a 1 on the dice, it can count as any number you desire. We're looking for a game where winning partially relies on being an accurate judge of human behaviour, and where rounds are short and fast enough that being able to predict the future in one particular instance won't be very helpful. You'd need to be able to maintain it across the entire game, which is far more difficult in most Magic systems. This also helps obfuscate the cheating through clairvoyance method. If we have hidden information at various different points of our game, it makes it far more difficult to make predictions based on this, especially if that hidden information is also hidden from even someone who could observe an individual's dice. For example, having a 1 be any particular number of your choice. At this point, it's probably easier to modify an existing game than build one from scratch, so I'd like to choose as a template for our game, Dudo. This game involves the rolling of a number, usually 5 dice, under a cup by each player, before players go around the table and bet on the outcomes of the dice under everyone's cups. Successively larger bids are made until a person is called out as a liar by the person immediately following them. At this point, all dice on the table are revealed, and the individual who has been called a liar must demonstrate that the dice exist to quantify their bid. For example, if they said that there were 7 5s on the table and there are in fact 8, that still constitutes 7 dice. They were not lying when they said there are 7 5s on the table, and therefore they win the challenge, and the challenger loses one of their 5 dice under the cup. If the one called a liar were to have overestimated the amount of a certain kind of dice on the table, well then they would lose a dice from their pool instead. The game then continues all the way around and around and around in multiple rounds until one person has some dice left. They are the winner. In Dudo, 1s indeed do count as wildcards, although in the classic game they count as whatever number has been claimed by whoever the claimant is the moment that the challenge is issued. And there are special combinations of die that you can build within your own cup that allow you to make claims specifically regarding that, which adds a further layer of complexity as well, such as a 5 of a kind or a straight of dice being in your particular possession. You can also be called a liar for claiming that you have that as well. It's genuinely a really fun game, and it doesn't have to involve gambling at all. It's from 15th century South America. Here's why it's a brilliant basis for avoiding as much cheating as possible. The act of only rolling dice under a cup means that telekinesis isn't terribly useful. If you can't see your own dice, what's the point of telekinetically turning them over? And once dice are all rolled, well, the sound of a dice turning over on the table is going to be very audible, especially if you use kind of thin metal cups. The ideal, I suppose, if we're going off what materials may not be able to be seen through by magic, may well be like lead, a thin layer of a lead cup, but that's probably not the best idea, all things considered. Any attempt to pick up your cup and look under it in Dudo must be done silently and without jostling dice, otherwise the game is void anyway. The exact same is true of things like telekinesis and moving your dice around underneath using other forms of magic as well. If you really want to avoid all magical shenanigans, you could instead use cups with a glass base, which would be, when placed down, on the top, enabling players to look inside their cups without disturbing them at all, as an extra safety measure to avoid magical or physical interference. If you also wanted to avoid any sort of visual contact with dice, specifically because many spells require a line of sight, you could also use these glass bottoms, uncover them, and use mirrors, angled mirrors, so that people can look into their own cups without observing the actual dice inside directly, meaning that most spells in most magic systems could not then be cast to influence them. That would be a very paranoid way of doing it and would require the use of a handheld mirror, which were not the most common of things throughout history. There's only a few problems with this game as is. In bluffing games, the ability to enchant your opponent is pretty powerful, because you can essentially make them lose by stating ridiculous numbers, as is the ability to communicate with an ally around the table secretly using magical messages. In games where not everyone has the same information, having more information is better. In addition to these problems, a game of bluffing in a world where mind reading is a legitimate option kind of just fails to work. We could at this point just give up on our attempt. I mean, really, if someone is able to read your mind, an asymmetric information game of bluff is not the way you want to go. So perhaps we should just play a game of pure skill or pure chance, like craps or roulette. Although, in that case, someone with the ability to move the tools telekinetically may cause significant problems as well. But as long as you can guarantee that, say, the dice rolls in a game of complete chance aren't tampered with, well then it's okay. I mean, goodness, even the ancient Romans had dice towers, and if you just took the extra step to attach a gathering box on the bottom of them, so that the moment the dice is actually finished rolling and there's no more sounds from it, it can be opened up and revealed to everyone what the dice roll is, that wouldn't be an awfully difficult thing to build, nor would it be a massive time waster. It would also kind of increase suspense with the opening of the box and the reveal to everyone if they'd won or not. It works. The trouble with games of chance, though, is that they're not everyone's cup of tea. The trouble with games of pure chance, though, is that they're not everyone's cup of tea, and they have a tendency to get old quite fast. Having skill expression in a game gives it an enjoyable depth and intensity, as well as a capacity to play people at the game, which increases social cohesion and the fun of gaming with other people. People generally prefer to have something of a say in the outcome because generally we assume we're better than average at these things. Now, some of you, for the past 5 minutes, will have been shouting at the screen. Shouting that this dudo game I'm describing is basically just the game the pirates play in Pirates of the Caribbean on Stranger Tides, just with a few extra conditions and multiple rounds instead of just the one. And there is something that we can take from the way that the pirates play this kind of the Liar's Dice style game, and that is the general name of these kinds of game, that would make dudo more effective in a fantasy world. The bets and wagers are made before any dice are touched, before the game begins. This limits the ability of mind readers to bet big on the game when the situation arises. If you're able to throw money in mid-round and raise the stakes based upon the information you're getting from everyone else, that is a very different game to one where the stakes are agreed at the start, and if the dice don't go your way, it doesn't matter how well you can read minds. This is part of the key. If we can combine it with something that is not present in Liar's Dice games more generally, I believe we should add a stipulation wherein hands of dice, as in the ones under your specific cup, have their own way of providing a reward structure within the situation of the game. Perhaps having 4 numbers in a row, when you only have 4 dice left under your cup, gets you an extra dice back after the round is all over. Or maybe having doubles when you only have 2 dice left gives you immunity from losing a dice in that particular round, allowing you, therefore, to bet more aggressively and be more disruptive, despite the fact that you're a lower impact player. You have fewer dice, allowing some interesting push and pull on that front as well. Perhaps there's even a rule in some house games that I envisioned when I first watched the Liar's Dice scene, because I didn't actually see the players look at their dice throughout the entire first round of the game, which, if you look very closely, they do. It's just not highlighted by the cinematography. But if it were so that you could not even look at your own dice during the first round of claims, that would not only build suspense, but would also really hamper those who are trying to use mind reading, give a chance for anyone else even to beat them at their own game, beat them with no information on the table at all. This could be a common house rule for our Liar's Dice style game. You could even use an external die, the kind of odd-even die I proposed earlier, to set the tone of which house rule is being used in which round, which adds that extra layer of complexity that makes it very difficult to predict the game's outcome with future sight. And you could even have that external dice form part of your hand, allowing for the building of 6 of a kinds if you have 5 dice under your hand, or entire straights of 1 to 6 as essentially a common dice, like in poker, that allows everyone to use that as part of their building of interesting and novel ways of winning the game. There are a lot of potential variations, as with many games that have some significant history to them. But I hope this thought experiment has been useful, either in introducing you to a fun new game, which, for the record, doesn't have to be done with gambling. Dudo is plenty fun enough even without wagering anything. And I do hope this video hasn't served as an endorsement of problem gambling by using the term fun. It is specifically because historically these things are done as entertainment and a pastime. Or perhaps I've presented a game that you feel is workable enough to be a reasonable thing for commoners to play in a world filled with magic and suspicion of creatures reading minds being not fabrications but an actual fact of life. Because there's nothing worse than presenting a world of magic and then presenting your characters with an immediate ability to break open generation-old games with the most basic of minor magical tools. Are you really trying to tell me that no one in the history of the world has ever tried using a mage hand to shunt a dice over before? Every world's magic is different, but I hope this has demonstrated in a broad sense how to design something that is playable, fun, and reasonable to exist in a world of invisibility, magic, and prophecy. And I do hope that you also check out The Wandering Tavern. It is a brilliant, characterful book filled with 100% human-made things, from art to the cookbook that's included. It's actually genuinely very interesting. And if you do want to find out more, the link in the description. And if you are thinking of buying it, use the code GrungeonMaster, all caps, for 10% off, and to help out the channel as well. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the GrungeonMaster. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.